We continue Marcus Brutus in Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. I know very well that women seem to be of too weak a nature to be trusted with secrets, but certainly Brutus, a virtuous birth and education, and the company of the good and honourable, are some force to the forming of our manners. And I can boast that I am the daughter of Cato, and the wife of Brutus, in which two titles, though before I put less confidence, yet now I have tried myself, and find that I can bid diffidence to pain. Which words having spoken, she showed him her wound, and related to him the trial that she had made of her constancy, at which he, being astonished, lifted up his hands to heaven, and begged the assistance of the entities in his enterprise, that he might show himself a husband worthy of such a wife as Porcia. So then he comforted his wife, and was it Dite or Theo, or is it Daemon or Damon? Because people say gods. What do they mean? I mean, obviously, it's something they're worshiping, but a meeting of the Senate being appointed, at which it was believed that Caesar would be present, they agreed to make use of that opportunity, for then they might appear altogether without suspicion, and besides, they hoped that all the noblest and leading men of the Commonwealth, being then assembled, as soon as the great deed was done, would immediately stand forward and assert the common liberty. The very place to where the Senate was to meet seemed to be, by divine appointment, favorable to their purpose. It was a portico, one of those joining the theatre, with a large recess, in which there stood a statue of Pompey, erected to him by the Commonwealth, where he adorned that part of the city with porticos and the theatre. To this place it was that the Senate was summoned for the middle of March. The Ides of March is the Roman name for the day, as if some more than human power were leading the man thither, there to meet his punishment for the death of Pompey. As soon as it was day, Brutus, taking with him a dagger, which none but his wife knew of, went out. The rest met together at Cassius's house, and brought forth his son, that was that day to be put on the manly gown, as it is called, in the forum, and from thence, going all to Pompey's porch, stayed there, expecting Caesar to come without delay to the Senate. Here it was chiefly that anyone who had known what it had purposed would have admired the unconcerned temper and the steady resolution of these men in their most dangerous undertaking, for many of them, being praetors and called upon by their office to judge and determine causes, did not only hear calmly all that made application to them, and pleaded against each other before them, as if they were free from all other thoughts, but decided causes with as much accuracy and judgment as they heard them with attention and patience. And when one person refused to stand to the award of Brutus, and with a great clamor and many attestations appealed to Caesar, Brutus, looking round about him upon those that were present, said, Caesar does not hinder me, nor will he hinder me from doing according to the laws. Yet there were many unusual accidents that disturbed them, and by mere chance were thrown in their way. The first and chiefest was the long stay of Caesar, though the day was spent, and he being detained at home by his wife, and forbidden by the soothsayers to go forth upon some effect that appeared in his sacrifice. Another was this: there came a man up to Casca, one of the company, and taking him by the hand, "You concealed," said he, "the secret from us, but Brutus has told me all." At which words, when Casca was surprised, the other said, laughing, "How came you to be so rich of a sudden, that you should stand to be chosen aedile?" Well, politicians shouldn't be chosen on their wealth, but when was there ever a break in the Western world from that? So near was Casca to let out the secret upon the mere ambiguity of the other's expression. Then Papilius Lanus, a senator, having saluted Brutus and Cassius more earnestly than usual, whispered them softly in his ear, and said, "My wishes are with you, that you may accomplish what you design, and I advise you to make no delay, for the thing is now no secret." This said, he departed, and left them in a great suspicion that the design had taken wind. In the meanwhile there came one in haste for Brutus's house, and brought him news that his wife was dying. For Porcia, being extremely disturbed with expectation of the event, and not able to bear the greatness of her anxiety, could scarce keep herself within doors, and at every little noise or voice she heard, starting up suddenly, like those possessed with a Bacchic frenzy, she asked every one that came in from the forum what Brutus was doing, and sent one messenger after another to inquire. At last, after long expectation and waiting, the strength of her constitution could hold out no longer. Her mind was overcome with her doubts and fears, and she lost the control of herself and began to faint away. She had not time to betake herself to her chamber, but, sitting as she was amongst her women, a sudden swoon and a great stupor seized her, and her color changed, and her speech was quite lost. At this sight her women made a loud cry, and many of the neighbors, running to Brutus's door to know what was the matter, the report was soon spread abroad that Porcia was dead, though, with her women's help, she recovered in a little while, and came to herself again. When Brutus received this news, he was extremely troubled, not without reason, yet was not so carried away by his private grief as to quit his public purpose. For now news was brought that Caesar was coming, carried in a litter, for, being discouraged by ill omens that attended his sacrifice, he had determined to undertake no affairs of any great importance that day, but to defer them till another time, accusing himself that he was sick. As soon as he came out of his litter, Papilius Lanus, he who but a little before had wished Brutus good success in his undertaking, coming up to him, conversed a great while with him, Caesar standing still all the while, and seeming to be very attentive, the conspirators, to give them this name, not being able to hear what he said, but guessing by what themselves were conscious of that this conference was the discovery of their treason, were again disheartened, and looking upon one another, agreed from each other's countenances that they should not stay to be taken, but should all kill themselves. There's got to be another way. And now Cassius and some others were laying hands upon their daggers under their robes, and were drawing them out. Brutus, viewing narrowly the looks and gestures of Lanus, and finding that he was earnestly petitioning and not accusing, said nothing, because there were many strangers to the conspiracy mingled amongst them, but by a cheerful countenance encouraged Cassius. And after a little while, Launus, having kissed Casar's hand, went away, showing plainly that all his discourse was about some particular business relating to himself. Now when the Senate was gone in before to the chamber where they were to sit, the rest of the company placed themselves close about Casar's chair, as if they had some suit to make him, and Cassius, turning his face to Pompey's statue, it is said to have invoked it, as if it had been sensible to his prayers. Now, that's not necessarily what people believe when they worship through statues or with the statue as a representative, but certainly, idolatry is, shirking in two ways, because you're not directly referring to the entity that, you're worshiping other than God, and you're not, worshiping your creator in the first place. That can be associated with it. I'm not saying that, but what do people mean and intend inside, right? Trebonius, in the meanwhile, engaged Antony's attention at the door and kept him in talk outside. When Casar entered, the whole Senate rose up to him. As soon as he was sat down, the men all crowded round about him and set Teleus Cimber, one of their own number, to intercede in behalf of his brother that was banished. They all joined their prayers with his, and took Casar by the hand and kissed his head and his breast. But he, putting aside at first their supplications, and afterwards, when he saw they would not desist, violently rising up, Teleus, with both hands, caught hold of his robe and pulled it off from his shoulders. And Casca, that stood behind him, drawing his dagger, gave him the first, but a slight wound about the shoulder. Casar, snatching hold of the handle of the dagger, and crying aloud in Latin, "Villain Casca, what do you?" He, calling in Greek to his brother, bade him come and help, and by this time finding himself struck by a great many hands, and looking around about him to see if he could force his way out, when he saw Brutus with his dagger drawn against him, he let go Casca's hand that he had hold of, and covering his head with his robe, gave up his body to their blows, and they so eagerly pressed towards the body, and so many daggers were hacking together, that they cut one another. Brutus particularly received a wound in his hand, and all of them were besmeared with the blood. Casar being thus slain, Brutus, stepping forth into the midst, intending to have made a speech, and called back and encouraged the senators to stay. But they, all affrighted, ran away in great disorder, and there was a great confusion and press at the door, though none pursued or followed, for they had come to an express resolution to kill nobody besides Casar, but to call and invite all the rest to liberty. It was indeed the opinion of all the others, when they consulted about the execution of their design, that it was necessary to cut off Antony with Casar, looking upon him as an insolent man, an affecter of monarchy, and one that by his familiar intercourse had gained a powerful interest with the soldiers, and this they urged the rather because at that time the natural loftiness and ambition of his temper, there was added the dignity of being consul and colleague to Casar. But Brutus opposed this consul, insisting first upon the injustice of it, and afterwards giving them hopes that a chance might be worked in Antony. For he did not despair, but that so highly gifted and honorable a man, and such a lover of glory as Antony, stirred up with emulation of the great attempt, might, if Casar were once removed, lay hold of the occasion to be joint restorer with them of the liberty of his country. Thus did Brutus save Antony's life. But he, in the general consternation, put himself into a plebeian habit and fled. But Brutus and his party marched up to the Capitol, in their way showing their hands, all bloody, and their naked swords, and proclaiming liberty to the people. At first all places were filled with cries and shouts, and the wild running to and fro, occasioned by the sudden surprise and passion that every one was in, increasing the tumult in the city. But no other bloodshed following, and no plundering of the goods in the streets. The senators and many of the people took courage and went up to the men in the Capitol, and a multitude being gathered together, Brutus made an oration to them, very popular and proper for the state that affairs were then in. Therefore they applauded his speech and cried out to him to come down. They all took confidence and descended into the forum. The rest promiscuously mingled with one another, but many of the most eminent persons attending Brutus conducted him in the midst of them with great honor from the Capitol, and placed him in the rostra. At the sight of Brutus the crowd, though consisting of a confused mixture, and all the disposed to make a tumult, were struck with reverence, and expected what he would say with order and with silence, and when he began to speak, heard him with quiet and attention, but that all were not pleased with his action. They plainly showed that when Cinna, beginning to speak and accuse Caesar, they broke out into a sudden rage and railed at him in such language that the whole party thought fit again to withdraw to the Capitol. And there Brutus, expecting to be besieged, dismissed the most eminent of those that had accompanied them thither, not thinking it just that they who were not partakers of the fact should share in the danger. But the next day the Senate, being assembled in the temple of the earth, and Antenna and Plancus and Cicero, having made orations recommending the concord in general, and an act of oblivion, it was decreed that the men should not only be put out of all fear or danger, but that the consuls should see what honors and dignities were proper to be conferred upon them. After which done, the Senate broke up, and Antenna, having sent his son as a hostage to the Capitol, Brutus and his company came down, and mutual salutes and invitations passed amongst them. The whole of them being gathered together, Antenna invited and entertained Cassius, Lepidus, the same to Brutus, and the rest were invited and entertained by others, as each of them had acquaintance or friends. And as soon as it was day, the Senate met again and voted thanks to Antenna for having stifled the beginning of a civil war. Afterwards, Brutus and his associates that were present received encomiums and had provinces assigned and distributed among them. Crete was allotted to Brutus, Africa to Cassius, Asia to Trebonius, Bithynia to Cimber, and to the other Brutus, Gaul about the Po. After these things, they began to consider of Caesar's will and the ordering of his funeral. Antenna desired that the will might be read, and that the body should not have a private or dishonorable interment, lest that should further exasperate the people. This Cassius violently opposed, but Brutus yielded to it, and gave leave, in which he seems to have a second time committed a fault. Well, it's not as important as marriages, but, or maybe it's even more important than making marriages a more public thing. When someone's dead, it's best to allow for as many people to attend the funeral services as possible. Of course, we don't need to do like what didn't Lenin stay in a case for days? other people. For as before, in sparing the life of Antenna, he could not be without some blame from his party, as thereby setting up against the conspiracy a dangerous and difficult enemy, so now, in suffering him to have the ordering of the funeral, he fell into a total and irrevocable error. For, first, it appearing by the will that Caesar had bequeathed to the Roman people 75 drachmas a man, and giving to the public his gardens beyond Tiber, which now the Temple of Fortune stands. The whole city was fired with a wonderful affection for him, and a passionate sense of the loss of him. If only when all our politicians died, we all got 75 good days' pays as a result, right? Isn't that basically what they're saying? And when the body was brought forth into the forum, Antenna, as the custom was, making a funeral oration in the praise of Caesar, and finding the multitude moved with his speech, passing into the pathetic tone, unfolded the bloody garment of Caesar, showed them in how many places it was pierced, and the number of his wounds. Now there was nothing to be seen but confusion. Some cried out to kill the murderers, others, as was formerly done when Claudius led the people, tore away the benches and tables out of the shops round about, and heaping them all together, built a great funeral pile, and having put the body of Caesar upon it, set it on fire. The spot where this was done being moreover surrounded with a great many temples and other consecrated places, so that they seemed to burn the body in a kind of sacred solemnity. As soon as the fire flamed out, the multitude, flocking in some one part and some from another, snatched the brands that were half burnt out of the pile, and ran about the city to fire the houses of the murderers of Caesar. But they, having beforehand well fortified themselves, repelled this danger. There was, however, a kind of poet, one Cinna, not at all concerned in the guilt of the conspiracy, but on the contrary one of Caesar's friends. This man dreamed that he was invited to supper by Caesar, and that he declined to go, but that Caesar entreated and pressed him to do it very earnestly, and at last, taking him by the hand, led him into a very deep and dark place, whither he was forced against his will to follow in great consternation and amazement. After this vision he had a fever the most part of the night. Nevertheless, in the morning, hearing that the body of Caesar was to be carried forth to be interred, he was ashamed not to be present at the solemnity, and came abroad and joined the people, when they were already infuriated by the speech of Antenna, and perceiving him, and taking him not for that Cinna, who indeed he was, but for him that a little before in his speech to the people had reproached and inveighed against Caesar, they fell upon him and tore him to pieces. This action chiefly, and the alteration that Antenna had wrought, so alarmed Brutus and his party that for their safety they retired from the city. The first stay they made was at Antium, with a design to return again as soon as the fury of the people had spent itself and was abated, which they expected would soon and easily come to pass in an unsettled multitude, apt to be carried away with any sudden and impetuous passion, especially since they had the Senate favorable to them, which, though it took no notice of those that had torn Cinna to pieces, yet made a strict search and apprehended in order to punishment those that had assaulted the houses of the friends of Brutus and Cassius. By this time also the people began to be dissatisfied with Antenna, who they perceived was setting up a kind of monarchy for himself. They longed for the return of Brutus, whose presence they expected and hoped for at the games, and spectacles which he, as praetor, was to exhibit to the public. But he, having intelligence that many of the old soldiers that had borne arms under Caesar, by whom they had lands and cities given them, lay in wait for him, and by small parties at a time had stolen into the city, would not venture to come himself. However, in his absence, there were most magnificent and costly shows exhibited to the people, for having brought up a great number of all sorts of wild beasts, he gave order that not any of them should be returned or saved, but that all should be spent freely at the public spectacles. He himself made a journey to Naples to procure a considerable number of players, and hearing Canutius that was very much praised for his acting upon the stage, he wrote to his friends to use all their entreaties to bring him to Rome, for being a Grecian, he could not be compelled. He wrote also to Cicero, begging him by no means to admit being present at the shows. This was the posture of affairs when another sudden alteration was made upon the young Caesar's coming to Rome. He was son to the niece of Caesar, who adopted him and left him his heir by his will. At the time when Caesar was killed, he was following his studies at Apollonia, where he was expecting also to meet Caesar on his way to the expedition which he had determined on against the Parthians. But, hearing of his death, he immediately came to Rome, and to ingratiate himself with the people, taking upon himself the name of Caesar, and punctually distributing among the citizens the money that was left them by the will. He soon got the better of Antony, and by money and largesses, which he liberally dispersed amongst the soldiers, he gathered together and brought over to himself, out of the hatred which he bore to Antony, sided with young Caesar, which Brutus took so ill that he treated with him very sharply in his letters, telling him that he perceived Cicero could well enough endure a tyrant, but was afraid that he who hated him should be the man, that in writing and speaking so well of Caesar, he showed that his aim was to have an easy slavery. But our forefathers, said Brutus, could not brook even gentle masters. Further, he added, that for his own part he had not as yet fully resolved whether he should make war or peace, but that as to one point he was fixed and settled, which was never to be a slave, that he wondered Cicero should fear the dangers of a civil war and not be much more afraid of a dishonorable and infamous peace, that the very reward that was to be given him for subverting Antony's tyranny was the privilege of establishing Caesar as tyrant in his place. This is the tone of Brutus's first letters to Cicero. The city being now divided into two factions, some betaking themselves to Caesar and others to Antony, the soldiers selling themselves, as it were, by public outcry, and going over to him that would give them most. Brutus began to despair of any good event of such proceedings, and resolving to leave Italy, passed by land through Lucania, and came to Elea by the seaside. Now, Naples, but I've, Naples is, you don't know whether they're translating a term sometimes, and you say it, oh, well, if this is Latin or Greek, this is how I would pronounce it. And so if you're seeing discrepancies like Itala for Italy and that sort of thing, that's what's going on. From hence, it was thought convenient that Porcia should return to Rome. She was overcome with grief to part from Brutus, but strove as much as was possible to conceal it. But in spite of all her constancy, a picture which she found there accidentally betrayed it. It was a Greek subject, Hector, parting from Andromache, when he went to engage the Greeks, giving his youngest son, Astyanax, into her arms, and she fixing her eyes upon him, when she looked at this piece, the resemblance it bore to her own condition made her burst into tears, and several times a day she went to see the picture, and wept before it. Upon this occasion, when Achilles, one of Brutus's friends, repeated out of Homer the verses where Andromache speaks to Hector. But Hector, you to me are father, and our mother too, my brother and my loving husband true. Brutus, smiling, replied, but I must not answer Porcia, as Hector did Andromache. Mind you your loom, and to your maids give law. And as I've talked before, in reference to divinity in particular, the more worldly idea of servant, master, friend, child, parent, spouse, it's not that you actually take God, or in this case, your friend or whatnot, in those roles. It's that these roles are for their sake, or are in line with their purpose or something, maybe according to their principles, or however you want to phrase that. For though the natural weakness of her body hinders her from doing what only the strength of men can perform, yet she has a mind as valiant and as active for the good of her country as the best of us. This narrative is in the Memoirs of Brutus, written by Bibulus, Porcia's son. Brutus took ship from hence and sailed to Athens, where he was received by the people with great demonstrations of kindness, expressed in their acclamation and the honors that were decreed him. He lived there with a private friend, and was a constant auditor of Theomnestus, the academic, and Cratippus, the peripatetic, with whom he so engaged in philosophical pursuits that he seemed to have laid aside all thoughts of public business, and to be wholly at leisure for study. But all this while, being unsuspected, he was secretly making preparations for war, in order to which he sent Herostratus into Macedonia to secure the commanders there to his side, and he himself went over and kept at his disposal all the young Romans that were then students at Athens. Of this number was Cicero's son, whom he everywhere highly extols, and says that whether sleeping or waking, he cannot choose but to admire a young man of so great a spirit and such a hater of tyranny. At length he began to act openly, and to appear in public business, and being informed that there were several Roman ships full of treasure that in their course from Asia were to come that way, and that they were commanded by one of his friends, he went to meet him about Carustus. Finding him there, and having persuaded him to deliver up the ships, he made a more than usually splendid entertainment, for it happened also to be his birthday. Now, when they came to drink, and were filling their cups with hopes for victory to Brutus and liberty to Rome, Brutus, to animate them the more, called for a larger bowl, and holding it in his hand, on a sudden, upon no occasion or forethought, pronounced aloud this verse: But fate my death and Leto's son have wrought. And some writers add that in the last battle which he fought at Philippi, the word that he gave to his soldiers was Apollo, and from thence concluded that this sudden and unaccountable exclamation of his was a presage of the overthrow that he suffered there. Antistius, the commander of these ships, at his parting gave him 50,000 myriads of the money that he was conveying to Italy, and all the soldiers yet remaining of Pompey's army, who, after their general's defeat, wandered about Thessaly, readily and joyfully flocked together to join him. Besides this, he took from Cinna 500 horse that he was carrying to Dolabella and to Asia. After that he sailed to Demetrius, and there seized a great quantity of arms that had been provided by the command of the deceased Caesar for the Parthian war, and were now to be sent to Antony. Then Macedonia was put into his hands and delivered up by Hortensius the praetor, and all the kings and potentates round about came and offered their services. So when news was brought that Caius, the brother of Antenna, having passed over from Italia, was marching on directly to join the forces that Vatinius commanded in Dyrrhachium and Apollonia, Brutus resolved to anticipate him and seize him there first, and in all haste